Good morning. Thank you very much to all for attending, and also in no small part to the organizers and supporters of this event. My name is Joan Key. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan and a Ford Foundation Scholar at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce today's panelists. The first is, I think, very well known to many of you, Abby Chen. Abby Chen is the head of contemporary art and senior associate curator at the Asian Art Museum here in San Francisco. She started this role in 2019, and in this very short period of time, I like to call her the woman who could build an airport in 3 months, because in this very short period of time, she has commissioned public art from Bay Area artists, including Chanel Miller, Jennifer Wofford. She was instrumental in securing the largest collection of Bernays Binh, which is on view at the Asian until May 2023. She has made numerous acquisitions, including artworks by Teresa Hakyung Cha, Kei Sekimachi, Carlos Villa, Michael Zhang, Wesley Thompson, and many, many others. On November 18th, her exhibition, Konke, Warring States Cyberpunk on Asian Futurism, will open at the museum's showcase space, the Yamazaki and Yang Pavilion. Our second panelist today is Binh, who teaches photography at San Jose State University. He is a proud alumnus of Stanford, having received his MFA here, and his work investigates his Vietnamese heritage and our collective memory of war, the work that deals with mortality, memory, justice, evidence, and spirituality. He has a very innovative technique where he takes a chlorophyll printing process in which photographic images appear embedded in leaves through the action of photosynthesis. His newer body of work focuses on 19th century photographic processes, and he applies them in an investigation of battlefield landscapes. His work is in the permanent collections of the National Gallery of Art, SF MoMA, the De Young, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the George Eastman Museum, and many others, which it would probably take at least another 10 minutes to say. Our third panelist is Patrick Flores, who is professor of art studies at the Department of Art Studies at the University of the Philippines and curator of the Vargas Museum in Manila. He is the director of the Philippine Contemporary Art Network. Among his voluminous publications are Painting History, Revisions in Philippine Colonial Art from 1999, Past Peripheral, Curation in Southeast Asia Art, 2008, Art After War, 1948 to 1969, published in 2015. And he was the artistic director of the Singapore Biennale of 2019 and the convener of the forums for the Taiwan Pavilion at the Venice Biennale this year. One also small side note is that he is the only art historian to grace the Art Review Power 100, where he was cited as resisting the trends towards spectacular gestures in favor of an idea of lasting change. Our last, and certainly by no means least panelist, is Winnie Wong. Winnie Wong is also a professor in the Bay Area. She is associate professor of rhetoric and the history of art at the University of California, Berkeley. I understand that Cal and Stanford are rivals, much like Michigan and Ohio State, but let that not detract from today's panel. She is a historian of modern and contemporary art and visual culture with a special interest in fakes, forgeries, frauds, copies, counterfeits, and other non-art challenges to authorship and originality. Her research is based in the southern Chinese cities of Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and her writing engages with Chinese and Western aesthetics, anthropology, intellectual property law, and popular culture. Her award-winning book, Van Gogh and On Demand, China and the Ready-Made, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2014, and her articles have appeared in numerous prestigious venues, including Positions, Issue, Art Forum, and Third Text. So without further ado, please join me again in welcoming our panelists.
Good morning. Not loud enough. Good morning. Well, thank you, Joan, and thank you, Marcy, Alisa, Alan, Addie, Mark, Gordon, for the hard work, clear vision, great team, and generous invitation. This conference is a testament to how the Bay Area is forming the critical mass, whether it is at the Cantor, east of the Pacific, Stephanie Sahuko at the Anderson, Kelly Akashi in San Jose Museum of Art, and not to forget Kathy Liu at Chinese Culture Center. Yes, Kathy. And the newly formed CMAX, last but not least, Tomi Arai, Ho Yumei, Claire Roja at the soon opening Chinatown Rose Park Station. Big ass public art. This is where we see soft power of cultural capacity and strong leadership of the younger generation. In response to today's panel, I picked these two images that give me a sense of intimacy. Bernice Bing's self-portrait, painted in 1960, currently on view at Asian Art Museum, and Conky's comic drawing made in 2022, opening on November 18th. Having worked in a non-collecting organization, Chinese Culture Center, for the 12 years, the constant reminder of how few Asian American artists in public space and major institutions has always been a strong motivation of my work. When I joined Asian Art Museum in 2019 to start its first contemporary art department, I was determined to build a strong collection of Asian American artists. Bernice Bing, Carlos Villa, Kei Sakimachi, Teresa Ha-Kyung-cha are some of the first of the acquired works in the past 3 years. Born in San Francisco, Chinatown in 1936, Bing was orphaned at a young age and grew up in a series of foster homes. She found refuge and sanctuary during her childhood in art that laid the foundation for her long and lifelong pursuit of liberation and belonging. Painting became one of her outlets to break free. Her practice in abstract expression was an ongoing negotiation between unlearning the familiar Eurocentric training and relearning and embracing her once distant cultural roots. Known for her abstract paintings, the particular work on the screen is very special. I remember when I first saw it in the storage unit during the most intense time of COVID, the mere discovery of such work actually existed was striking. For a moment, I froze. Wearing a medical face mask myself, I somehow felt her secret presence. Her energy was transmitted through the moist, breathing air behind my mask. In this rare self-portrait painted in 1960, when Bernice Bing was 24 years old, she depicts herself wearing a white mask that recalls a Japanese theater tradition no, a form of performance art based on stories of supernatural creatures become human. The mask is an instrument of performance that she uses to hide and show, embodying a sense of vulnerability, protection, uncertainty, and maybe a sense of playfulness as well. Guessing from an actor's point of view, a mask is often used for training. It takes away their total identity. The power to unleash the imagination comes from that mask. The power also shields one from attack. You can be anonymous, to hide your emotion. Instead of expressing everything you want, it can also protect you from everything it hurts. The mystical vibe of the mask prompted my deep dive into her archive, which is now kept at Stanford Library. There were obvious obstacles to Bing's pioneering forms of fusion and rupture being recognized. Not only was she a woman living and working on the West Coast, as an Asian and a lesbian, those factors did play a part. But more fundamentally, it was Bing's radical care, her uncompromising belief in alternative space, grassroots organizing, and her fostering of a cultural ecosystem for artists of color that made her and her practice less likely to be understood, let alone celebrated, within the larger art world of the time. From the archive, it became obvious that Bernice Bing cared about living more than making a name for herself. In America, Chinatown is out of place. She spent a lot of time with the community there, finding a place within the place. For her, she herself was also an in-between place. The way she engaged with the community is through art, and by working as an art administrator that comes with scarce resources, trying to bridge the reality of Chinatown and the mainstream of high art. She saw the huge gap between the two. Instead of going to New York or solely depend on developing a professional career in art, she tried to figure out where does this place belongs. It is a conscious choice, which is not a typical choice. It's a lot to give up, but also in a hidden way with a lot to gain. Those paths was not tracked before. She was the pioneer of the pioneer. In our generation like now, we made it happen. In her generation, she prepared it for this to happen. Those were real work of art too. And now I would like to talk about the work on the right by Kong Ki. It's an imaginary robot revealing herself, letting go of the human mask. It is also an intimate act of sharing and exposing her memory stored in a cassette tape. Known by the title as a singer, this mysterious figure is an android that rises up from a river. She carries memories from the Warring States period more than 2,000 years ago, a memory that could be belonged to the preeminent poet Yuan, who drowned himself when his country was taken over by the first emperor. Yuan was mourned by the Dragon Boat Festival, with people chanting on the water that carries generations' longing to bring back his spirit. Instead of like the ancient people that couldn't detach their identity from their land and nation, Kong Ki, hoping to reimagine an alternative, is determined to make sense of things by intervening the past with the future. He tries to deconstruct what makes attachment, like Yuan did, and hope to find a new way out. Similar to many curious artists of the previous generation, how to move forward and take new reality by either concealing or revealing. In today's environment, Kong Ki, who was born in Malaysia, educated in Hong Kong, and currently based in London, felt the temperature of history of warring state repeating in the form of tyranny, algorithmic society, pandemic, and urban development today. This key image of the female protagonist in his comic carries an old soul of humanity to fight the new fight. As I was thinking about our gathering yesterday and today, I juxtaposed these two work together because they are my two worlds intersecting and happening now. I'm both here and there, in the past and future. That's my constant Asian American reality, a constant state of becoming. Thank you.
Hey, hello everybody. Of course, I want to thank everybody here for coming. I want to especially thank Marcy and Elisa for inviting me to be part of IMU at UR2. I want to share this portrait of my mom in response to our panel, Global Intimacy. Intimacy could take on many levels, from the feeling of love that ranges from platonic relationships to marriage and partnership that leads to sexual desire, even offspring. This portrait of my mom was made when she was 16 years old. It announced that she was single and ready to marry. The text in the right-hand corner translates to a lonely boat, so meaning a lonely person. Last week, my mother detailed to me more about this photo, as I was wondering if this was a common practice of matchmaking in South Vietnam. We can also relate this practice to the picture bride or mail order bride method in early 20th century of Asian immigrants in Hawaii and West Coast of the United States and Canada, through a matchmaker who paired bride and groom using only photographs and their parents' input. And of course, this matchmaking method of using pictures is nothing new to our social mediated world of apps such as OkCupid and Tinder. Although in our times, most of these partnerships are not arranged by parents' input. In my mom's case, she said that this practice was suggested to find a partner, sometimes by the parents wanting to advertise their daughters, or the daughters themselves giving them more agency to find a partner. And it was an under the radar practice. My mom said that it was she who went with her friends to a photographer's studio in town that was known for superimposing text onto photographs. One of the many choices she was presented with, she chose this one, Linden Mo Compton, which was a line from a popular Vietnamese song. I asked Mom, did Dad see this picture? How were you two introduced? And how long did you date before getting married? She said the dating period was a few months, and of course she was naive, being 16, and the next thing she knew, the wedding day was planned. She said that Dad probably saw this picture in the photographer's studio displayed in the store window, so really an advertisement. Mom said that the photographer was proud of this portrait and made an enlargement to display for customers to see. So my dad sought her out when he saw this picture. My dad, born in 1951, is 1 year younger than my mom. He came into town with the South Vietnamese Army doing patrol work. He is ethnically Cambodian, and his father, whom he did not have a close relationship, was a well-known captain of the South Vietnamese military. So my parents got married, raised 4 kids. The Vietnam War ended in 1975, and I'm the youngest, born in 1971. And little did my mom know that in 1978, around 11 years later, when my father set eyes on this photograph, she was metaphorically not only on a lonely boat, but she would be crammed onto a refugee fishing boat escaping Vietnam in the middle of the night. Many Vietnamese who were desperate to leave Vietnam under communism rule could not do so through the official channels. They have no government or American connection that would entitle them to a spot on the American plane, or they have no money to buy a seat. So the other means of escape was by boats. They were rickety, overcrowded, and vulnerable to attacks by pirates in the South China Sea. Many Vietnamese believe that peace would prevail in Vietnam under North Vietnamese rule. However, the new government instituted oppressive measures such as the end of private businesses, restriction on the press, the re-education of those associated with the South regime, and the relocation of the urban population to the countryside to work on the fields. Both people prepared for the escape for many months, slowly gathering such supplies as food, water, and gasoline. One day, my brother went to school and told everyone that we would escape soon. We were going to America. Of course, refugees don't know which asylum country would accept them. It would have easily been we were going to Germany, France, or Israel. Once the official got words of my family's plan to escape, my father was arrested and the plan was delayed. My family and I laugh about this now at family gatherings, but at that time it was scary if Dad was ever going to be seen again. After outwitting the local official, our boat sailed into the South China Sea and faced the perils of an ocean voyage, pirates, and starvation. And untold numbers of boat people died at the sea. In the year we escaped, 105,500 Vietnamese made the journey. Many were family units, husbands, wives, children, aunts, and uncles risking their lives for freedom. Vietnamese American poet Dinh Tu Le, who passed away in 2019, wrote, "Can you imagine human hair floating all over the sea, children's bodies ready to dissolve as human meat dinners of fish. But they kept on leaving as humanity turned their heads away, and still they serenely throw themselves into death. We arrived at Pulapi Down refugee camp in Malaysia on June 11, 1978, and were one of the first groups of boat people. Malaysia, Thailand, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Singapore have been considered first asylum countries. These camps have been overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of refugees, all needing housing, food, clothing, and medical attention. By the end of the decade, Pulapi Down refugees' number grew to 40,000 Cambodian, Laotian, and Vietnamese crowded into an area the size of a football field. Life continued in the refugee camp as people waited for second asylum countries to accept them. Refugees went to country where they were assigned. On September 12, 1979, the U.S. Embassy granted my family asylum. The U.S. policy was to spread the refugees across the country to minimize the economic threat that a concentration of them could pose to a local community. Because of cultural isolation, separation, and loss of intimacy from families and friends, soon after resettling, many relocated to ethnic enclaves in California, Texas, and Louisiana, and revitalized many American cities. So bring this all back to the both motifs. Once refugees resettle and planted roots, obtain citizenship status, once the anchor is thrown out, the strategy for Vietnamese adults is to sponsor their parents, who often stay back to protect the family home and ancestral gravesite. At last, if all goes planted, grandparents will get to meet their grandchildren who have grown up in the United States. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. The painting titled Egg Vendors, dated 1955, is by Anita Magsaysay Ho, a woman artist in the modern period in the Philippines. Yeah, I will, madam, yeah. The painting titled Egg Vendors, dated 1955, is by Anita Magsaysay Ho, a woman artist in the modern period in the Philippines, a scene that was dominated by men. It depicts a faithful of women in the market gathering to see one of them discern an egg's condition through its appearance, cupping and lifting it to glean its interior with an acute gaze. There is something ritualistic about this gesture in which an expectant congregation awaits judgment from one of their own who holds an egg to the illumination of an electric bulb, as if they were in some kind of prayer or liturgy to consecrate the suitable victual, the aesthetically and ethically good for the consumption of the human body, and the economically viable for the commerce. Reflecting on the prompt of this session, I wish to dwell on some aspects of the phrase global intimacy as it relates to the painting. With regard to the global, the modern or modernist paintings such as Egg Vendors may be considered a condition of globality itself. The global modernity of painting as a medium is a proposition that implicates a pedagogical system in which a particular kind of modernism was taught in Europe and America and made to disperse across the world through colonialism, Orientalism, internationalization, globalization, and other forms of exchange, asymmetrical or otherwise. The creative history of the artist Magsaysay Ho bears traces of this procedure. Having studied at the University of the Philippines School of Fine Arts, a legacy of the Spanish academic tradition, she then went to the Art Students League in New York and the Cranbrook Academy in Michigan to further her art studies. Such a sequence speaks to the ascendancy of the Euro-American modern, which in the Philippines in the late 20s meant a shift from the picturesque tradition towards Art Deco, Post-Impressionism, and the School of Paris during American imperialist rule. This modernist turn was largely signaled by the return to Manila of Victorio Edades, who studied architecture and painting at the University of Washington after working at a salmon cannery in Alaska. That Magsaysay Ho is a woman, however, provides another instance of this global modernity via the personage of the woman artist who practiced within a pervasively patriarchal structure. This, too, is an inflection of a modern consciousness that is potentially feminist. In New York, she was mentored by Kenneth Hayes Miller, who belonged to the Ashcan School and was once a communard in Oneida. The description of the critic Robert Pincus Witten of Miller's matrons seems to elicit the antithesis of Magsaysay Ho's graceful women. In Pincus Witten's words, and I quote, features are generalized so that all subjects seem devoid of idiosyncratic differences and part of the same porcine family. In Michigan, Magsaysay Ho attended the classes of the Hungarian migrant Zoltán Zepesi, who was variously associated with the American scene, precisionism, and regionalism, and was internationally known for his deft handling of egg tempera. To be global likewise means to be situated within a capitalist art market that invests the art object and the stature of the artist with the commodity function and its attendant reifications. It must be noted that Magsaysay Ho is one of Southeast Asia's most expensive artists. Egg vendors sold at an auction for around $1 million in 2021. It might not be intuitive to discuss this painting and the painter within the Asian American continuum. After all, Magsaysay Ho cannot be readily and legibly be identified as Asian American. But this counterintuition might be my gambit, a way to unhinge the rubric of Asian American from the inveterate poetics of recognition, identity, and representation, and to let it absorb instead the history of travel, aesthetic education, personal sensibility, exposure to modernism, the entitlement to and anxiety of influence, and the predicaments of inheritance. And in this project, I give the materiality of the painting and the practice of the painter a chance to offer a theoretical reflection on what should be a historicized category of the Asian American, and not merely to be theorized upon or made to validate the norms of being Asian in America at a given moment, and to be quickly named Asian American or not Asian American. The imagination is to open up the Asian American to another collective, like what we see in Magsaysay Ho's painting, in which a civic body or a sensible polity hopes to see something emergent through and in the midst of worldly and otherworldly light, with the closed eyes of anticipation. Relating globality with intimacy creates interesting resonances within the work. At the outset, the intimacy is evoked by the community of women, something akin to a sisterhood of sellers in the market, marked by the painter's signature trope of white kerchiefs and long necks, which remind me of the modernist Modigliani or the mannerist Parmigianino, although Magsaysay Ho confines that she was mostly drawn to the folk life world of Bruegel, a painting of whom she saw in a museum in Michigan. Intimate as well is the woman in the painting, touching the shell of the egg, the see-through exterior that shelters the yolk, at once an index of frustrated formation and the industry of food. The act simultaneously erotic and empiricist, the substance mutating, and the threshold between inside and outside a diaphanous membrane. This intimacy is mediated by a specific material, which is egg tempera, consisting of an emulsion of water, egg yolks, or whole eggs, occasionally with a little glue, honey, or milk, and conveying alternating effects of transparency, opacity, and a satin-like sheen. The egg that is represented and the egg that is the medium enable the rendering of light, alongside the condition of the possibility of a distinct kind of light through a cherished form of luminosity and translucence. It is light that makes the depicted object, the egg, visible and makes the source of light the depicted electric bulb palpable as well. But it is also light that disseminates, scatters, fills the space, and casts the work of art as concrete, visible, and inevitably collectible. It must be mentioned that the most prized works of Magsaysay Ho are those done in egg tempera. Through the possessive light of what may well be a spirit or specter, the notion of global intimacy therefore turns into what I would call, by way of Magsaysay Ho's scintillating painting, an intimate totality, in which the imitation of a material's qualities becomes the very metabolism of visual form and the source of its attractiveness in the market, and in which a woman artist, women vendors of eggs, and a painting mediated by a kindred egg all bear witness to the formative nature of life and its persuasive artifice in art. It is an imbrication that inaugurates an auspicious assembly, an embryonic subjective community that may well ramify productively as Asian American, via a gendered intelligence that passed through America and returned to a post-colony elsewhere to reconceive an origin. My inchoate argument might be that the materialization of art performs a possible social form that is translucent and luminous, which may well be speculatively the much-awaited aesthetic, or the sensuous particularity of the Asian American, just like egg tempera or the vigilant convening women of a woman painter from an archipelago. Thank you.
I just want to thank my fellow panelists for such beautiful and moving presentations. It's an honor to speak after you. I will speak today about the painter Matthew Wong, who passed away 3 years ago this month. Before I speak, I want to acknowledge the unabated grief and pain of everyone who knew and loved him, including his parents, his friends, and perhaps some in this room. Matthew touched the lives of so many people he encountered, briefly or virtually, and transformed the daily thoughts of so many who knew him. In writing and speaking of Matthew Wong, the fine line between honoring him as a person and constructing a public persona of his importance as an artist is very difficult to tread, for each addition to the public construction holds the potential to harm a private and deeply cherished memory. Despite that, the reason I venture to speak about Matthew Wong's life in this panel on global intimacies is because I think we can learn a great deal about Matthew's own struggles with the boundaries of the public and private in 21st century life, and the deeply conflictual ways in which, using social media, he as an artist strived to build and maintain connections with other artists. Matthew's digital friendships were central to his creative process, but his mental health struggles that ended with a suicide also speak to the horizons of possibility for artistic community in the globally dispersed yet digitally connected lives that we all lead. So my image today is this public Instagram post cobbled together from my own screenshots made 4 days after Matthew Wong's passing. The writer, Mademoiselle Nadia, is not known to me, but her profile names her as Nadia Komolova, locates her in Moscow in France, and mentions an art community of 1994. She has posted here what I believe is a painting by Matthew and what reads as a direct message to him. Her words are a stream of raw emotions upon learning of his death that are very painful to read. In reaching out across the unbreachable gulf towards Matthew, she asks him if he remembers a verse they shared. She wishes she could tell him about a film, and she reveals her regret for not having the time to meet him in person in life. Nevertheless, she insists on the warmth and sensitivity of Matthew as a person she knew online, and the very real support that he gave her personally. She delivered this message to Matthew publicly because he was gone in both the bodily and the virtual sense. Her post remains public on Instagram today. Nadia's post is just one among many, many similar posts that indicate what was a very large, widely dispersed, yet deeply personal artistic community that Matthew Wong built on social media. He did this with at least 3 successive accounts on Instagram, and prior to that, also on Facebook, and before that, on Tumblr. Perhaps not surprisingly, these accounts emerged alongside his own artistic development in the practices of photography and painting. I surmise that his relationship to these accounts was also deeply conflictual, because while he obsessively used them, he also habitually deleted them, deleted posts, and then at various critical moments in his life, he deleted the entire accounts. Among Matthew's virtual acquaintances that I have had the privilege of getting to know since his passing, most are painters. Many read or write poetry. Many love movies and music. A remarkable number of them were also, like Matthew, artists who had grown up from an early age in a culture different from where they were born. Matthew Wong was born in Toronto, Canada, and spent much of his childhood and adult life in Hong Kong. As an artist, he began as an English-language poet in Hong Kong. He was a regular participant in a number of well-established poetry circles and gave weekly readings at them. He developed deep friendships with other poets, painters, actors, photographers in those spaces. He had, in other words, a very real, a very close-knit artistic community, one might say even a fellowship in Hong Kong. When Matthew left Hong Kong, he had a period of wandering before landing in the unlikely city of Edmonton, Alberta, on the western prairies of Canada, where he ultimately took his own life. Edmonton, Alberta also happens to be my hometown and the place where I was born, and so whether by personal knowledge or bias, I imagine that I understand the kind of isolation and alienation Matthew must have experienced there as a Chinese Canadian and sometime Hong Konger who happened to want to be an artist. Matthew developed the habit of walking the nights alone in Edmonton's parks. He left for his studio very early every morning and worked there alone every day. He ate a dessert alone at a downtown restaurant every night. His studio was located where there is really nothing. If you've never been to Edmonton, I don't think you understand the meaning of nothing. In many of Matthew's paintings, I see the alienation of Edmonton's 4-feet snowbanks, its dark, dark winters, the long, flat road that takes you to the airport, and the high horizon line of the ubiquitous river valley which blankets the city with trees. The Nahia Waywin, or Cree, name for the river, is Kasitzkawani-Sipi, and it was a boundary between the lands of several First Nations. Edmonton, or Amiskawachi-Wassiskiakan, was a way stop on several ancient traveling routes. It is also a place now where us immigrants from Hong Kong, China, Syria, Somalia, Nigeria, Poland, Ukraine, Vietnam, and the Philippines have also found an unlikely and fragile home. As in so many North American cities, Edmonton's Chinatown has been devastated by the economic inequalities of our broader society and the anti-Asian hate crimes of the pandemic. If it was once a settlement stable enough to raise a gate, Chinatown as it stands today does not look like it will endure. The migration of Chinese workers from 4 counties of Guangdong province to what we now call Western Canada dates as early as the 1780s. Chinese labor migration throughout the 19th century was highly place-based and patterned on the extended relations of our ancestral villages. It was not always a pretty process. My own parents ended up in Edmonton only after being driven away from other towns by other Chinese immigrants. Today, it is quite possible for an immigrant in Canada to joyfully rediscover an old schoolmate now living down the block in a seemingly anonymous suburb. To be an artist is to be apart in a profound sense. To be an immigrant is to rarely exercise the privilege to be alone. In the past year or so, many Hong Kong artists living in exile have turned to social media to create and sustain practices that extend beyond the boundaries of nation, city, or diaspora. Cobbling together a mixture of safety and monetization across Vimeo, Patreon, Signal, and the like, there is a collective expression of grief at the destruction of loss. We mourn a city, a generation, and a collective future. And we mourn the inability to mourn. Matthew's use of social media was from the before times, and so it was quite different. He used it to build a community out of nothing. He used it to forge friendships that were filled with sweetness and humor. He used it to share a vast volume of poetry, music, and art. And he used it to befriend artists regardless of where they were located, how far along they were in their careers, whatever might have been their struggles and successes. In one of his last projects, Matthew was painting responses to other artists' digitally posted works, taking their photographs, paintings, or poems and responding with great vulnerability in his own visual language. Social media made it possible for Matthew to work in a nowhere place like Edmonton while constructing a virtual intimacy with what might have appeared to have been the center of the art world. And so, in addition to the sadness of losing Matthew Wong from this world and all that he may have painted, we feel also the sadness of losing the artistic community that he built. Because his friends did not share a school, a studio, an exhibition, or even a city, it existed only privately in relation to him. They are each far-flung across the world, and their connections were not to one another, but to Matthew. That cannot be reconstituted, even if social media gives us the mirage of data permanence. The lore of Bohemia is said to be nothing but fantasy and nostalgia, but in a real and bodily sense, Bohemia did bring people from far-flung places into one place at one time, with all the resulting chaos, privation, conflict, rivalry, and love. A digital Bohemia is something else altogether, and the fragility and beauty of Matthew Wong's life of global intimacy should help us reflect on how and by what means we want to build our communities now. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our wonderful panelists for their moving but also very different approaches to the theme. Just by way of disclosure, none of us actually chose the theme. It was given to us. So in some ways, it gets to part of what I want to think about is so that intimacy is not so much a proxy for closeness or adjacency, but rather about how does it concern the work of muddling through different scales or different registers so that certain words are iterated. So one is, say, community, but another would be the question of boundary or instability, that intimacy is, again, not always something that is desirable or that it's also something that can be a source of harm as well. A couple of themes that seemed foregrounded. So one is that distinction between the public and the private. So this is, I think, something that courses throughout all four contributions today. So one, when you talk about, again, how is it that social media also enables intimacy at the same time, it can seem as if it's demanding an excessively sort of fuller self-disclosure. Another question that I had was, how is it that closeness registers very differently if it's through virtual media? And so this is also where I want to perhaps think about how is it that intimacy is really about the tension that's generated when you're trying to inhabit or understand something that is not you. And so this is also where thinking about, rather than thinking about entities, can we actually think about what are sort of the boundaries that need to be crossed or identified before any kind of closeness can be realized? When we talk about intimacy, are we also wanting something that is, in fact, impossible? So that's another question that I also had for Binh as well, is that there seems to be a dynamic between wanting to know something very well versus how is it that wanting to know can push back against indifference. So in some ways that I saw your paper as wanting to rejection recognition or acknowledgement as kind of the end point, that this is the work that you showed the provisionality of the work, something that seems as if not only it had a past, but yet a future that had not yet been articulated. I found that very interesting because in some ways, does that get to, how is it that intimacy also presumes instability? You know, are there good and bad intimacies, for example? Or is it that, how is it that detachment or alienation, is that actually a condition that intimacy asks of us? So that's another question that I was interested in hearing your answers. Patrick, you also, I think, emphasized that relationship between the self and other. And so on the one hand, and I might be completely misreading you, so on the one hand, it sounds that you are asking about the hope of a togetherness founded in reciprocity. So rather than think about words like influence, which is of course the bugbear of any of us who work on global majority art, so rather than influence, can we talk about becoming intimate with? So in other words, experiencing or attempting to experience that which we recognize as separate, but also as having its own claims to sufficiency. So this is very different than intimacy as, say, like or love. And this is one question I also wanted to ask all the panelists, too, is that I feel that sometimes intimacy is often conflated in terms of some kind of positive or affirmative feeling, when in fact it is the opposite, or something that is very much not about the positive that is really central. I was also struck by many of the panelists' use of words such as assembly or community. And in Patrick's case, it also struck me whether you are advocating for a certain kind of maybe polyamory in a way, that comparison, not so much as in terms of compulsory mating, where you have two things that are sort of glommed, sort of pushed together, but rather about how do we allow for multiple loves or multiple kinds of relationships, right? Now, Abby's paper, I thought, foregrounded a very important question, which is how does intimacy actually play out through different kinds of methods of knowledge gathering? The studio visit, for example, having to negotiate with an artist's estate. So I think for historians or critics or curators, this is something that's both very delicate, it can be very tender, but it can also be very contentious. And I'm wondering, Abby, as, again, being a museum professional, this in some ways is kind of the heart of your, what it is that you do. And this is also a question that coincides with many of, I think, sentiment is not quite the right word. Many of the threads of inquiry, I think that Winnie, you were bringing out about the act of research, which is, again, something that perhaps we take for granted in terms of collecting or the accumulation of materials. But what was especially very sort of profound for me about your contribution was, again, how is it that research involves having to define what intimacy might entail and what kinds of losses or deficits does, say, research have us face or have us deal with? Because again, that especially when you deal with a living artist or an artist that has recently passed, these kinds of very sort of complex questions about what is it that you can bring and what is it that you take. I feel like that becomes very raw. And I was wondering also if you might be willing to talk about that a bit. So.
I guess I'll start. That was a lot of questions. But I guess there was a particular question directed to all of us in very unique ways. And I'm trying to recap some of them. But thinking about just the good and bad of intimacy, I guess, like obviously when my mom made that portrait of herself, she didn't know this history is just going to happen, right? She didn't know she was going to be on a boat. Intimately close to a lot of people. You know, the bad part is she died, right? The bad part is the boat sank, I guess. I think one thing that you unite us, I guess, as a panelist in ways that there's a wanting to archive material, if it's social media posting or myself collecting family photographs that that I discovered through the family archives or working in museums and stuff. I think that part is a good part of the wanting to save and share these stories. So, I mean, I know there's a lot. I should pass it on to my other colleagues here.
Yeah, thank you, Joan, for those questions. Tough questions. But I was struck by when you raised the issue of alienation as some kind of intrinsic part of intimacy, and to some extent, the Magsaysay Ho case demonstrates that the education in the U.S. is some form of alienation, an imposition of the modern, right? But it was also an aspiration, and so there was this desire to be educated in the modernist system, and I see the intimacy inscribed in mastery, the mastery of the system. Now, I don't see mastery as necessarily repetition, but as intimacy that enables the alienated to make certain claims to the system, a certain entitlement to the system, to produce a new form, yeah, or to exceed the like pedagogical maybe model. No? So I see that, you know, that kind of alternation of mastery, alienation, and intimacy. Also, I was trying to experiment with the writing of this text. I wanted to perform imbrication textually. So maybe that's another level of intimacy. I wanted to, I mean, I don't know if I succeeded, but the desire was to imbricate the materiality of the painting and the materiality of the potential subjectivity. Yeah. So that was my effort. No? I always try to do that so that I don't thematize a particular concern, like global intimacy. Yeah.
Patrick, I loved your phrase to reconceive origins. I thought that was very resonant with some of the things I've been thinking about with respect to this research question. You know, of course, we have this problem no matter what we work on, whatever craft we take up. I think this both the violence of it and the pleasure of it. But I think for me, my interest in Matthew Wong began with learning that he was from my hometown, really. And so necessarily this is a project about learning about myself. And that that two-way intimacy, you know, that this is not just a research, you know, craft of my work as a historian, but it is a research of one's own origins in some way, or constructing, reconceiving those origins through our own craft. I mean, I think many of us, you know, who were trained in this modernist tradition as well in our own craft, are now trying to reconceive how we practice it while opening up to these other collectivities, as Patrick was describing as well, right? So it is a much much deeper, much more problematic two-way street, right, than it was ever, than we were trained to do.
As a curator, I actually don't work with a lot of artists who are not alive. A lot of times I mainly work with living artists where I see my role as a soundboard, like assisting them to complete an exhibition or realize their vision. But it started with Wesley Thompson and now Bernice Binh, just really trying to understand the material. Because once the artist passed away, what you got left is just stuff. It's just objects. So how to develop that kind of connection with those objects, human connection, meaningful connection, you really need to rely a lot on archive. And I'm not somebody who used to work with a lot of archive, but with Bernice Binh, started a little bit with Wesley Thompson, but then with Bernice Binh, I really, really took a deep dive. I struggled with it at the very beginning, but that mass portrait kind of kept me going. It's just somehow that mystique quality of that work just haunted me. It made me, because when we was watching the documentary film and hearing people talk about her, she's so strong. But then once you started to dive into the archive, you also realize she has a lot of like these moments of vulnerability and at times very weak that she struggled with herself. So that was one part about when I think about intimacy. It's associated with a lot of pain, I think, and even more so, I think, with Conky. This robot android seems so strong with technology, seems to be invincible, but then once they started to carry the human memory, that memory itself kind of humanize it, and then finally, as a curator, I could make sense of Asian Art Museum. I mean, because when I first went into the museum, I kind of feel like, I'm going to do this Asian American art thing. I'm going to bring all the living artists in. It was a very kind of a direct, simple intervention in a way. But with Conky's work, finally I can make a connection with the 1,000-year-old object because they were just so distant, caged in this glass box. But somehow now, with Conky's imagination, there's a reason that I at least I could make sense of myself to make that connection. Then I have the intimate relationship with the object, which I felt I was so alienated by. And then I think Stephanie Sohoko previously talked a lot about that too, is these objects with the colonial gaze was so distant from us, even though it's from our culture. But finally, I started to make sense of it. That's my intimate moment.
Questions for each other. How are we doing on time? Well, I don't have a. Oh, yeah. Oh, I have. Okay, great. So that's it. Well, one just sort of basic question before I think we would like to open it to the audience, and there's so few people that I would love to call on, actually. One is that why the images that you chose? Just a very basic question. Just from my own morbid curiosity, not morbid, delighted curiosity, sorry.
In my case, there were a lot to choose from, but they're also disappearing quite quickly, and you don't know how they you don't know why. You're not connected to the disappearance. So I chose one that was still here. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in my case, I was always fascinated with this photograph, and I've used this image before. And I just always wanted to know if my parents were in love in ways, because growing up, I never hear them express that love to each other, or even to us. So then it was understandable. It was more of a cultural thing. So, but I think I wanted to understand them as a couple, right? To understand like how much they know each other. And then, I think we talk a lot about alienation. I think just coming to the U.S. and developing sort of alienation between where you live, between, family being separated, between, just working for, like multiple jobs to make ends meet, just those sort of like moments of my life where there was lack of parental intimacy, right? Like when I was growing up, I never really saw my mom because she was always working in the computer chip factory. She was a piece worker where she put chips onto computer boards, here in Silicon Valley, and I imagine she was so intimate with that, working with her hands, and then later on she became a manicurist, because again, that skill that she kind of carry over. So it's just trying to like explore those ideas.
I was drawn to some formal elements in the painting that gave me entry points into a possible theoretical reflection. So I was struck by of course, the egg tempera. It's important. The community of women in the market also gave me an entry point into a possible reflection on a kind of convening. No? I wanted to historicize that painting in relation to this idea of Asian American, at the same time that I wanted to also aestheticize the history. So that was the concern,
I struggled with the many images I could choose, but the final three was actually, one is in the Chinatown Rose Park Station's paper cut mural. It was also a very intimate image for me, but Marcy helped me edit down. Actually, everybody had one slide. So I still cheated a little bit with two images, because these two images I couldn't get them out of my head when I think about this topic.
Thank you very much. I like the idea that you couldn't get out of your head that in some way the image that chose you and said, I am not going to be dislodged. I'm going to, it's like when you have the roommate that won't move out. It's like, I'm staying here. I'm staying right here. So that's, thank you so much.
They did that.
That's, yeah. So I have two questions from the audience. So one is, what are some methodologies for holding space for diasporic artistic practices defined by a constant form of becoming and cyclical time in which past and future are intertwined? And could you give some examples from your respective areas of practice or research? Yeah.
I have an idea. I've been thinking about Matthew Wong in relation to a longer, to artists like Li Tie-fu, other artists who, just as Patrick described, was here briefly, not really sure where they went to school. They said they did somewhere. And sort of tracing these shared itineraries across a very long period of time, over 100 years, and in different spaces, not necessarily New York, not necessarily Toronto, not necessarily London or Paris, but actually retracing the same journey, and also the journey of a very incomplete return, like returns that are also not returns, returns that, in different directions. And then also forcing myself to think comparatively, to think about why Canada does not have a modernist narrative of return, why aren't they proud to be trained somewhere to return to Canada? Why aren't they proud to announce themselves as immigrants in America? Sort of as a kind of counter mirror to the claim of diaspora. Because we need more than one valorized story of it, I think.
I also think about this question a lot, but just looking at Bernice Binh and Kong Ki, I feel like before you create a space or even hold a space, you first need to refuse, to reject, because I think Binh rejected so many other places that she could go to. And in Carlos Villa's interview with Lenore, and Carlos Villa asked, like, she was the very first one to go to this nonprofit alternative space that seemed to be kind of like a lower kind of class space. But now that after I look at the whole archive and look at how she kind of navigate these spaces, I think she first reject those places that seem like high art or something. And then she knew how good she was. Then she carved out those spaces and kind of telling other fellow artists that, look, even I am doing shows in these places, so you could do shows here too. So kind of using kind of her own self to carve out that space. And the same thing for Kong Ki. I mean, Hong Kong is not known to have an animation industry. And this collective individuals just refuse to accept that reality and so determined to carve out that space for animators. It's just, I mean, crazy. It's a whole industry. But then they refused that, and then they was so determined to do it. And I don't think there's shortcut, there's no magic formula. You just kind of need to throw yourself out there, I guess.
I just want to just piggyback on that too, just as an artist. I mean, I've never really felt like in the Asian American art scene that it was sort of like this competitiveness. There's always an openness to share and to be part of. It wasn't always try to get yourself out of it. And so that's just sort of my experience. So again, just creating that space for other artists of same likeness to show and then to promote. And as you can see, from yesterday's panels too, that they talk a lot about our history. I think all of us sort of really go back to our roots and see that, this is possible for a new generation of Asian American artists.
So maybe, Joan, the space is one for like a migrant or migratory art history. I'm feeling my way through the Asian American discourse because this is my field. I come in from Philippine art history and from Southeast Asian art history. So I think that tension or relationship is very productive and instructive for me. The national art history or the regional art history, like in a way, dilates or ramifies through the Asian American, especially in relation to the Philippine case. But I also try to ask Asian American art historians how they bring into the account to integrate into the account the national art history, right? That might be lost in the narrative of the Asian American. So I think there's this movement between those, like the Southeast Asian or Philippine, and then the Asian American. So I think that that space is there, that back and forth is for me the space that can be developed in the future. Yeah.
I was actually thinking, when you brought up light and then you used the word translucency, which was really interesting because, I always wonder to what extent is Asian American art coincident. So there was a meme that was quite popular earlier this year. So it was, I used to be visible, now I'm invisible. My pronouns are no longer he, she, they are where and what. And it kind of reminded me of that in some ways, is say these kinds of gatherings. So there's a groundswell of critical and commercial interest in Asian American art. That is it the interest in thinking about Asian American art as an ontology is part of that. It's in some ways has been kind of invisible in a sort of a larger institutional sense until quite recently. And I'm wondering if the migratory patterns you're talking about it's really about some kind of middle ground between opacity and transparency, a sort of a translucency that's not quite clear, that's diffuse or diluted in some way, so that allows it to refract in different directions to create the kinds of narratives that I think, Winnie, you're talking about, getting away from these sorts of overarching abstractions and breaking it down to these granular, strange, interrupted, detours or, again, roads that maybe
particularities,
don't go.
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so eloquently put, Joan. But I also aspire to luminosity. Yeah, that's an ontology I also aspire to. So it's just not the criticality, but like some kind of a founding mystical moment too. I mean, I also look at that possibility. So this transparency and luminosity that egg temper, guarantees. Yeah.
We have another question from the audience. So how does bringing, terrible with handwriting, this is, again, email destroyed my ability to decipher the joy of artisanal script. How does bringing art from the Asian diaspora complicate or unsettle the categorical objectives of Asian American art? So following Patrick's logic, how might we begin with Magsaysay Ho in shifting Asian American art's focus on representation and opening up to engage in other kinds of intimacies, violence, and forms of belonging? Yeah.
I think that more, to animate that dynamic, between those spaces. In my case, like Southeast Asia, Philippines, and Asian American. So I think that's the only way to unhinge the Asian American from maybe its obsessions, and also to.
I like the verb unhinge.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to prefer intemperate, but unhinge is.
It's like maddening, no? And also to widen also the scope of national art history in the same vein. Yeah.
Other responses?
I think if we want to really dive deep and continue the topic on Asian American, the idea of Asian American must be very open, and it needs to intervene in into other spaces and allow other intervention as well. And I feel like that will keep this topic always fresh. And I think nobody was born Asian American. Asian American is really a concept that Asian American is a process of becoming, at least for me.
I want to echo Abby's earlier point about rejection and refusal. I mean, because it's also a lot about unbelonging, and we shouldn't have to belong to any of it, and we need to make space for this unhinged refusal as well from kind of notions of community. I'm not even sure diaspora of what, diaspora of where, if we don't accept that there are these centers or homes or origins of them.
Oh, well, I'm so sorry. We did have one question, but it's actually a Matthew Wong specific question. So I encourage the person who contributed this wonderful question to approach Winnie after the panel. So please join me in thanking our panelists for their contributions. Yeah.